The unseen struggle. James Walker was no stranger to being overlooked. At 15, he had already come to terms with the fact that people often made assumptions about him based on his appearance. With his youthful face, dark skin, and a calm demeanor that belied his intelligence, James had often found himself in situations where he had to prove his worth simply to be seen as equal. But today, as he stepped onto the plane bound for Chicago, something felt different. It wasn't the excitement of flying that filled him with anticipation. It was the quiet assurance he felt in his own skin. Today, he wasn't just a boy on a flight. Today, he was a young man who had earned his place in the world, and he had worked hard to get there. His father, a successful corporate lawyer who had always emphasized the importance of education, had booked James a seat in first class as a reward for his hard work. James had been studying non-stop, preparing for college exams that would determine his future. He wasn't a typical teenager, and his father knew that. The decision to treat James to first class wasn't just a gesture of kindness, it was a recognition of his dedication. As he boarded the plane, James felt a small sense of pride as he passed through the cabin. The first-class section, with its plush seats and wide aisles, was a far cry from the cramped economy seats he was used to. He had earned this, he thought. This moment was a small victory in his ongoing journey to show the world that he wasn't just another black teenager with a fleeting dream. He was capable of greatness. He made his way down the aisle, his boarding pass in hand. The flight attendants, some of whom had already begun their duties, gave him polite smiles as he passed, though he could sense a subtle shift in the air. The looks they exchanged told him that they were likely surprised to see someone like him in first class. He was used to it by now, the quiet judgment that lingered in the air, the assumption that someone who looked like him didn't belong in spaces like these. As he reached his seat, 3A, James slid his bag into the overhead compartment, his eyes scanning the cabin for any signs of trouble. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, they were telling him that something felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but a sense of discomfort lingered in the pit of his stomach. He sat down and buckled his seatbelt, pulling out his book as he settled in. It was in that moment that Linda Harper appeared. Linda was a flight attendant with over 30 years of experience. She had seen it all, businessmen in suits, celebrities with their entourages, and the everyday passengers that filled the middle and economy sections. But today, something about James caught her attention. The young boy sitting in the first-class seat seemed out of place. She didn't know why exactly, but it bothered her. Her instincts told her that he didn't belong there, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, that unsettled her. Linda was no stranger to making quick judgments. After all, her job required her to manage passengers and ensure they followed the rules. But today, her skepticism went deeper. Her eyes narrowed as she watched James, who was reading quietly, seemingly unaware of her gaze. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about him wasn't right. She hesitated for a moment before walking up to him. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice as sharp as her gaze. "Can I see your boarding pass?" James looked up from his book, his expression neutral. He had become accustomed to being questioned in similar situations, but there was something about the way Linda spoke to him that felt different. He calmly handed her his boarding pass. Linda took the pass from his hand and studied it closely. Her brow furrowed as she read the details. "This seat is in first class," she said, her voice laced with doubt. "Are you sure this is your seat?" James didn't flinch. He had dealt with worse in the past, subtle discrimination masked as questions. He knew how to stay composed. "Yes, ma'am. My father booked it for me," he replied, keeping his tone steady. Linda's lips pressed into a tight line, and for a moment, she seemed to consider her next words. "I see," she said curtly, handing him back the boarding pass. But as she turned to walk away, she lingered for a moment longer, her eyes narrowing in judgment. There was something about James that gnawed at her, and she couldn't let it go. James returned to his book, trying to push the encounter from his mind. His thoughts swirled with what had just happened. Why had she questioned him so harshly? His ticket was valid, his father's name was on it, after all. But the sting of being scrutinized for simply existing in a space that was meant for people like him. People who had earned their place, was a feeling he had grown used to over the years. Still, he pushed it aside and focused on the pages before him. It was just a flight, he told himself. Nothing to get upset about. But it wasn't over. A few minutes later, Linda reappeared. Her face was even colder than before, and she wasted no time in addressing him. "Young man, there seems to be a problem with your ticket. Could you come with me for a moment?" James blinked in surprise. A problem? He hadn't been notified of any issue. "I thought everything was fine," he said, his voice calm but edged with confusion. "I just need to verify something," Linda replied briskly. "Please, follow me." James hesitated for a split second, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right, but he didn't want to make a scene. He had always learned that keeping calm and composed was the best route, especially when confronted with situations like this. He grabbed his backpack and stood up, following Linda down the narrow aisle toward the galley. The passengers in first class watched, their eyes flicking between James and the flight attendant, their murmurs low and suspicious. As they reached the galley, Linda folded her arms across her chest and fixed James with a hard stare. "This seat isn't appropriate for you," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to the main cabin." James's heart dropped. The implication of her words was clear, his presence in first class was somehow wrong. He had done nothing wrong. His ticket was valid. He was a paying customer just like anyone else. But Linda's tone and gaze spoke volumes, he didn't belong here. He straightened his posture, trying to hold his ground. "If my ticket is valid, why should I move?" Linda's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "Because I said so. If you don't move now, I'll have to call security." James's chest tightened, but he didn't back down. He wasn't going to let her see his frustration. "Fine," he said quietly, swallowing the anger rising in him. He didn't want to escalate the situation. He simply wanted to be treated like everyone else. Linda led him through the first-class cabin, her pace quickening, and James's mind raced. How had it come to this? Why was she doing this? The murmurs of passengers surrounded him, their gazes burning into his back. They were witnessing something that didn't feel right, but none of them spoke up. As they reached the economy section, Linda pointed to a cramped middle seat. "Sit there," she instructed, her voice blunt. James stood still for a moment, his mind reeling. He had been moved from the spacious first-class seat to a cramped space in the back of the plane. He slid into the seat, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface, but he did his best to keep his face neutral. He placed his backpack under the seat and stared out the window, fighting the urge to lash out. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was an act of humiliation, a subtle yet powerful reminder that even when you followed the rules, you weren't always seen as equal. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to his father. "They moved me to economy. They said my seat wasn't valid. Can you check?" As he hit send, he took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. His father had always taught him the importance of handling adversity with grace. Today, however, he was finding that advice harder to follow than ever before. The sting of the flight attendant's actions was sharp, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something deeper was at play. And as the plane continued its flight, James knew this was far from over. The unexpected turn. James sat in a cramped economy seat, the hum of the plane's engines in the background, but his thoughts were anything but peaceful. The seat was smaller than he remembered, the armrests digging into his sides as if mocking his presence here. It was hard to focus on the words in his book, the tension in his chest making it difficult to breathe. He had been moved without cause, humiliated in front of the passengers who watched silently, and now he was left to wonder why. Why had Linda Harper, the flight attendant, treated him like that? What had he done wrong? His phone buzzed. He pulled it out, relieved to see a message from his father. "I'm on it. Sit tight. Everything will be fine." James smiled faintly. His dad always knew how to calm him down in times like this. He was a lawyer, well versed in the nuances of fairness and justice, and James knew that if anyone could fix this, it was him. Still, something in the back of his mind nagged at him. He had been on flights countless times before, and never once had a flight attendant treated him this way. No, this was different. This wasn't just an error, this was a reflection of something deeper. But what? Was it because of his age? His race? Or was it simply an old flight attendant clinging to outdated assumptions about who belonged in first class? As the plane cruised through the sky, James's frustration began to give way to a sense of determination. He wasn't going to let this pass. Not this time. His father had taught him to stand up for himself, to never let injustice slide. He would wait for his dad's intervention, but once they landed, he would make sure this situation was addressed properly. He wasn't going to let Linda's actions go unnoticed. This wasn't just about his comfort, this was about something far larger. It was about dignity, respect, and ensuring that no one else would have to face the same treatment in the future. Meanwhile, in the galley of the plane, Linda Harper was beginning to feel the weight of her actions. She had returned to the front of the plane with a sense of smug satisfaction, as though moving James had been some kind of victory. But now, as she passed through the aisles and interacted with the other passengers, a feeling of unease settled in her stomach. Something didn't feel right. The whispers of the other flight attendants, the passengers who seemed to watch her a little too closely, it was all starting to get to her. Linda had been a flight attendant for over 3 decades. In that time, she had developed an uncanny ability to read people, to spot who belonged in which spaces and who didn't. It wasn't always fair, but it was how the world worked, or at least how she had learned to navigate it. But James had thrown her off. There was something about him that had set her on edge. She had made a snap judgment about him, about his presence in first class, and it had cost her. As she handed out drinks to the first-class passengers, Linda's mind wandered back to the boy in seat 3A. The more she thought about him, the more uncomfortable she felt. He didn't fit the usual mold of someone who should be in first class. His clothes were nice enough, but they weren't the expensive suits or designer outfits she was used to seeing. He didn't carry the air of someone who was wealthy or important, and yet, here he was. She hadn't questioned it at first, but then, when he had handed her his boarding pass, something inside her had clicked. The doubt had crept in. And she had acted on it. But now, she was beginning to question herself. She hadn't checked his ticket thoroughly enough, and now the reality was starting to set in. What if she had made a mistake? What if this wasn't just some oversight, but something far more personal? What if the boy's presence in first class was valid, and she had wrongly judged him? Linda didn't have much time to dwell on her thoughts, as Dennis, the senior flight attendant, approached her in the galley. His expression was neutral, but there was an underlying tension in his gaze. "Linda, what's going on with the kid you moved?" Dennis asked, his tone calm but laced with curiosity. Linda's stomach churned as she turned to him, trying to mask her unease. "There was an issue with his ticket," she said, feigning indifference. "He didn't belong in first class, so I moved him." Dennis raised an eyebrow, a look of disbelief flashing across his face. "A ticket issue? Did you check it properly?" Linda hesitated, avoiding his gaze. "I didn't think I needed to," she replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice. "He just didn't look like he belonged there." Dennis shook his head, his expression darkening. "Linda, that's not how we do things. If his ticket was valid, you had no right to move him. We're not in the business of making judgments based on how people look. We treat all passengers equally." Before Linda could respond, the galley phone buzzed. Dennis grabbed the receiver, his frown deepening as he listened to the voice on the other end. "It's for you," he said, handing her the phone. Linda's heart skipped a beat as she took the receiver from him. "This is Linda," she said, her voice shaky. The voice on the other end was calm, yet firm. "This is the airline executive office. We've received a complaint about an incident involving a first-class passenger. We need you to ensure that all passengers are treated with respect and to refrain from taking actions without proper justification. We'll need a full report upon landing." Linda's blood ran cold. She knew exactly who the complaint was about. James. Her mind raced as she struggled to process what had just happened. She had moved him. She had assumed his seat wasn't valid, and now she was being asked to account for her actions. The thought of facing consequences sent a cold shiver down her spine. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anyone to care. "Yes, of course," Linda stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She hung up the phone, her hands trembling slightly as she turned to Dennis, who was watching her with a mixture of concern and disappointment. "You made a mistake, didn't you?" Dennis asked quietly. It wasn't an accusation, but a statement. Linda didn't answer, but the look on her face said it all. She had underestimated James. Meanwhile, in the economy section, James sat back in his seat, his gaze focused on the horizon outside the window. He had always loved flying, the way the world seemed to shrink beneath him, the sense of freedom that came with being so high above the ground. But today, the view didn't offer him any comfort. The frustration inside him simmered, threatening to boil over. He knew his dad would fix this, but a part of him felt the need to confront the injustice himself. He wasn't going to sit silently by and let this pass. The plane continued its flight toward Chicago, but for James, the journey had taken on a new purpose. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was a young man on a mission, one that would change everything. As the descent began, the cabin was filled with the usual chatter and bustle. But for Linda, the tension had only increased. Each time she passed by the economy section, her eyes flicked toward James. He sat there, calm and composed, his expression unreadable. It was clear to her now that this wasn't just any boy. This was someone who would not be pushed aside easily. The reality of her mistake was dawning on her. She had misjudged him, and now the consequences were already in motion. The question was no longer whether she had done something wrong, but whether she could fix it before it was too late. As the plane descended, Linda felt the weight of her actions pressing on her. She had never expected this flight to take such an unexpected turn. But as she would soon discover, the ripple effects of this incident would extend far beyond the confines of the airplane. And James? He was just beginning to realize that his journey had only just begun. The ripple effects. As the plane descended toward Chicago, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The world outside the window seemed to be closing in on him, the sprawling city below appearing so distant yet somehow within reach. He had always dreamed of being someone who made an impact, who stood for something greater than himself. But today, his desire for justice had become something more tangible. It wasn't just about the unfair treatment he had experienced on the flight. It was about setting things right and using the power of his voice to create a ripple of change. The rest of the flight had been a quiet ordeal. The passengers around him, although cordial, seemed to avoid eye contact. The whispers of the flight attendants were impossible to ignore. James had overheard snippets of conversation as they walked past, too focused on their duties to realize he was listening. "Did you hear about that kid in 3A? Can you believe she moved him? I don't know what she was thinking. Poor kid. That was so embarrassing." The pity in their voices stung more than he expected. He had been the victim of the humiliation, yet somehow, he felt as if he were the one being judged again, as if the people around him saw him as someone less deserving of the respect and dignity they so freely offered others. But he would not be cowed. Not now. Not ever. The plane's wheels hit the runway with a soft jolt, and the passengers began to stir, preparing for landing. Linda Harper, meanwhile, had all but forgotten the small, quiet boy she had humiliated earlier in the flight. She had spent the rest of the journey focusing on her duties, pushing away the nagging thoughts about her mistake. But now, as the plane approached its final descent, Linda was beginning to feel the weight of what she had done. Her thoughts weren't on her work anymore, they were on James. She had assumed he was just another teenager, young, unimportant, someone who didn't belong in first class. But now she knew she had been wrong. The phone call from the airline's executive office had made it clear, her actions had set something in motion. James wasn't just any boy, he was a Walker. And the Walkers were more than a well-off family, they were connected to the very fabric of the airline industry. The realization sent a shockwave of panic through her, but it was too late to change the course of what had already begun. Linda had always prided herself on knowing how to navigate social situations. She had always believed that a quick judgment, if made in the right moment, could save time and keep order. But now, as she prepared to confront James once again, she realized that the cost of those judgments had just escalated to a level she hadn't anticipated. As the plane taxied to the gate, James received another message from his father, "We'll be meeting you at the gate. Don't speak to anyone yet. I'm handling this." A sense of relief washed over him. His dad had been right when he said everything would be okay. But James couldn't help the little spark of defiance inside him. This was his chance, not just to let his father handle things, but to speak up for himself. He wasn't just the son of an influential lawyer anymore, he was someone who had been wronged, and he had every right to stand up for what was right. James tucked his phone back into his pocket and stood up, gathering his things with methodical precision. His dad's words echoed in his head, "Always stay calm, son. Your strength lies in how you handle adversity." Today, James would prove that he had learned that lesson well. The flight attendants began to prepare for disembarkation, but Linda couldn't help herself from casting glances toward James. He was sitting still now, his posture calm and controlled, his face a mask of neutrality. He was a boy, yes, but there was something about him that made Linda uneasy. His poise, the way he had handled her earlier with quiet dignity, it was all too calculated. She didn't know it, but she had underestimated him in the most profound way. The moment the plane finally came to a stop, Linda took a deep breath. It was time to face the music. As she moved toward the front of the cabin, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. She turned and saw Dennis walking toward her, his face serious. He wasn't smiling. "Linda, we need to talk," Dennis said quietly, his voice firm. Linda's heart skipped a beat. She knew what was coming. She could feel the consequences of her actions closing in around her. Before she could respond, the cockpit phone rang again. Linda picked it up, her hands trembling. "This is Linda," she said, trying to mask her fear. "Linda, this is the captain. We've been instructed to let you know that the young man in economy, James Walker, he's not just any teenager. He's the son of Richard Walker, a major shareholder in the airline. And I'm sure you know who Richard is." Linda's face drained of color. She had heard of Richard Walker, of course. The Walker family was well known in the business world. Richard was a powerful man, with a reputation that stretched far beyond the confines of the airline. Linda had made a critical error in judgment, and now it was coming back to haunt her. "Prepare yourself, Linda," the captain continued. "James's father is already on his way to the gate. You'll need to speak to him personally. It's best if you start by explaining your actions clearly and calmly." Linda's grip on the phone tightened, her mind racing. She couldn't face Richard Walker like this. She had made the worst mistake of her career, and now it seemed as though everything was about to unravel. As James stepped off the plane with his backpack slung over one shoulder, he scanned the terminal. The airport was bustling with activity, but his mind was focused on one thing: finding his dad. He spotted him almost immediately, standing near the gate with his usual confident posture. Richard Walker was an imposing figure, always impeccably dressed in his tailored suits, his dark hair carefully combed back. His presence in any room was undeniable, and today, his calm expression masked a storm that was building just beneath the surface. "Dad," James said, walking toward him. Richard's eyes softened as he saw his son, and he pulled him into a brief embrace. "Hey, champ," Richard said quietly, his voice filled with reassurance. "You okay?" James nodded, but his expression remained serious. "I'm fine. I just want this to be over. I don't want anyone else to feel like I did today." Richard's eyes darkened slightly. He wasn't just concerned for his son, he was angry. He had been through countless legal battles, but this was personal. Linda Harper had crossed a line, and now she would have to answer for it. Together, father and son walked toward the gate, where the airline's representatives were waiting. Linda Harper stood at the forefront, her face pale, her posture stiff. She had no idea what was coming for her, but she was about to find out. As James approached, his eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, everything else seemed to disappear. Linda swallowed hard, her throat dry. This was the moment she had feared. "Miss Harper," Richard began, his voice cold and commanding, "I think we need to have a conversation about how my son was treated on your flight." Linda braced herself. There was no escaping the consequences now. The ripple effects of her actions were just beginning, and she was about to learn just how far those waves could spread. Unraveling threads. The terminal was bustling with activity as travelers moved through the gates, oblivious to the tension simmering just beneath the surface. For Linda Harper, time had slowed to a crawl. Standing before Richard Walker and his son, she could feel her entire career, her reputation, teetering on the edge of a precipice. It wasn't just the humiliation she had caused James, it was the monumental mistake of assuming his place on the plane was a mistake. And now, here she stood, her future in the balance, trying to find words to salvage the situation. Richard Walker didn't speak immediately. His gaze locked on Linda with an intensity that made her feel small and insignificant. There was a long, uncomfortable silence before he broke it. "You moved my son to economy class," Richard began, his voice low but unmistakably authoritative. "Without cause. Without even confirming the validity of his ticket. You assumed something about him based on his appearance, didn't you?" Linda's throat tightened. She had assumed, yes, but admitting it aloud felt like she was digging herself deeper into a hole. The realization that this was no ordinary mistake was hitting her now, like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding between a flight attendant and a passenger, it was about class, power, and the deep-seated biases that Linda herself hadn't even acknowledged. I thought there was a mistake with the ticket," Linda stammered, trying to defend herself, but her words lacked conviction. She could feel the weight of Richard's gaze, and it made her heart race. "I saw a young boy in first class, and I—" "You saw a boy?" Richard interrupted, his voice sharper now. "You saw a teenager and made assumptions about his worth? His ability to occupy that seat?" Linda opened her mouth to respond, but the words failed her. What could she say? That she didn't think he belonged? That she believed his presence was out of place? The implications of her actions were suddenly clear in a way they hadn't been before. James, standing quietly beside his father, had been listening intently. He had expected this confrontation to be difficult, but the calm, controlled way his father handled it made him feel a sense of pride. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The power was in his presence, in the fact that Linda's actions had now escalated to a situation she couldn't ignore or deflect. "Dad," James said quietly, his voice steady, "I want to know how this ends. I don't want her to get away with it. Not just for me, but for anyone else she might do this to." Richard nodded, turning to his son with a proud smile, though his eyes were still fixed on Linda. "You're right, James. This isn't just about one incident. It's about the bigger picture. People like Linda, people in positions of authority, cannot be allowed to perpetuate this kind of behavior. James felt a surge of determination. He hadn't expected to feel so strongly about what had happened, but now that it was unfolding before him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was part of something much larger. His father was more than just a lawyer, he was a man who understood the nuances of power and influence. And now, James was beginning to understand how his family's position in the world could be leveraged for good. "Miss Harper," Richard continued, his voice calm but undeniably firm, "your actions are more than just a mistake. They are a reflection of a mindset that needs to be addressed, not only by you but by the airline you work for. This isn't about one passenger. It's about an entire system that has allowed people like you to make decisions based on assumptions, prejudices, and biases." Linda stood frozen, her mind scrambling for a response, but she knew it was over. There was no justification for what she had done. Even if she had been acting out of some misguided sense of duty, she had crossed a line. The realization made her knees feel weak. "You've taken it too far, Linda," Richard said, his eyes cold now. "And you will be held accountable for it. The airline will receive a formal complaint about your actions, and will ensure this situation is not swept under the rug. I will be speaking to the higher-ups myself. You've embarrassed not only my son but this entire airline." James took a deep breath, watching his father handle the situation with the same poise he had always admired. But this wasn't just about a formal complaint. It was about something much bigger, something more personal. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a random act of injustice. This was about standing up to systemic inequalities, to the small but powerful biases that people like Linda held without even realizing the damage they caused. "You should be ashamed," James said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension. His words were measured, but they carried a weight that Linda hadn't expected. Her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, but she couldn't argue. James's words struck a chord. She had crossed a line, and now she had to live with the consequences. "James," Richard said, his voice filled with pride for his son's composure, "you've handled this with more grace than most adults ever would. And I want you to know that this moment matters. It matters more than anything. You've taught me something today." James's heart swelled slightly. He had expected his father to handle the situation with his usual professionalism, but it was a humbling experience to hear his father acknowledge the impact of his own actions. This wasn't just about proving a point to Linda, it was about creating a ripple effect that would extend beyond the walls of this airport. Richard turned back to Linda, who was now visibly shaken. "You've humiliated my son, and you've shown a deep lack of judgment. But this isn't over for you. There are going to be consequences, and they will be felt not just by you, but by your entire organization." Linda felt a surge of panic. She had thought she could get away with a small mistake, but this was bigger than she had anticipated. Richard Walker had made it clear that he would not let her off the hook so easily. And it wasn't just the Walkers she had to worry about. The ripple effect of this incident would soon spread through the industry. People would start asking questions. And Linda, the once proud flight attendant, would be at the center of it all. "Please," Linda said, her voice cracking. "I never meant to cause harm. Richard raised a hand, silencing her. "I don't care about your intentions, Linda. It's your actions that matter. And now, those actions are going to have consequences." Just as the conversation seemed to reach its climax, an executive from the airline's corporate office approached. He was tall, dressed in a sharp suit, and had a calm yet assertive presence. He introduced himself as Richard's point of contact from the airline's headquarters. "Mr. Walker," the executive said, extending his hand, "I understand there's been an issue with a member of our staff. We take matters like this very seriously, and we're prepared to handle this appropriately." Richard shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate that. But let's be clear, this is only the beginning. I want a full review of the situation, and I expect swift action. If this airline stands by its commitment to fairness, Linda Harper will no longer be working here. Not after this. The executive nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation. He turned to Linda, who now appeared on the verge of tears. We will conduct a thorough investigation, Miss Harper, he said. You'll be placed on administrative leave until further notice. Linda felt a cold knot in her stomach. She had never been in a position like this before. Her career, her livelihood, everything she had worked for was slipping through her fingers. And it was all because of one moment of judgment. One moment of pride. As the corporate representative left to handle the administrative side of the incident, Richard turned to his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You did good, son. Very good. James smiled, but his thoughts were already turning to the bigger picture. This wasn't just a victory for him. This was a moment of reckoning for the airline industry. It was about making sure that the biases that had caused his pain today were no longer allowed to fester unchecked. The future was uncertain, but James was no longer the quiet boy in the back of the plane. He was someone who would be heard, and he was determined to use this experience as a stepping stone. Not just for him, but for others like him. He would make sure that the ripples of change started here and spread far beyond the walls of this airport. The ripple effect. The days that followed the confrontation in the terminal were filled with tension, both for Linda Harper and for James. For Linda, the reality of her actions began to sink in. She had thought of herself as a professional, an authority figure in the skies, but now, she was facing an impending downfall that she could not ignore. James Walker's quiet resilience had shifted everything in a way she couldn't have predicted. What had started as a simple misunderstanding, at least, in her eyes, had snowballed into a full-blown crisis. And now, she was trapped in its wake. Meanwhile, James couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. When the flight had landed and the immediate fallout of his confrontation with Linda had passed, he'd felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Yet, there was still a gnawing sense of uncertainty. His father had made it clear that they were going to take action, but James was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about one bad experience. This wasn't just about standing up for himself, this was about pushing for systemic change. Richard Walker, ever the strategist, had already begun making moves. As a seasoned lawyer, he knew how to navigate the complexities of corporate affairs, and when the airline had made its offer to handle the situation internally, he had smiled politely but firmly rejected it. We're not going to sweep this under the rug, Richard had told the executive from the airline's corporate office. I'm not asking for a token apology. I want systemic change. That statement had rattled the airline's higher-ups, and they knew they had a serious situation on their hands. But what Richard was proposing was not something they were prepared for, at least, not yet. He wasn't just seeking a severance for Linda Harper, he was after a full audit of the airline's employee training and practices, especially in terms of racial bias and discrimination. James had been stunned when his father had spoken up so firmly. He knew his dad was a force to be reckoned with, but it had never occurred to him that they could make such a sweeping change. It wasn't just about getting Linda fired, it was about ensuring that nothing like this would ever happen to anyone else again. That was the kind of justice James wanted, the kind that could create ripples of change, no matter how small or large. As the days went on, more people began to take notice. The story of James's humiliation spread like wildfire, reaching news outlets and social media platforms. Many of the passengers on the plane had taken to Twitter and Instagram to share their version of events, some calling out the airline for its treatment of the young boy in first class, while others questioned the flight attendant's behavior. The incident was soon trending, with hashtags like #JusticeForJames and #EqualityInTheSkies gaining traction. Support for James came in from all corners of the internet, with thousands of people demanding accountability from the airline. The online conversation sparked protests, petitions, and a national conversation about racial bias and inequality in the workplace. James watched all of this unfold, amazed by how quickly things were snowballing. But while it felt empowering to see the support for him, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all happening so fast, so much bigger than what he had expected. People were rallying behind him, not just as an individual but as a symbol of something more profound. Through it all, his father remained a steady rock. Richard had reached out to civil rights organizations, media outlets, and even a few prominent activists, ensuring that this moment would not be lost in the noise of daily headlines. The Walker family was determined to not let this be just another viral story. They wanted action, tangible change that would ripple through the airline industry and beyond. The day the airline executives finally responded, they had prepared a formal statement. They acknowledged the complaint, apologized for the actions of their employee, and promised an internal review of their policies. But James had learned by now that words alone didn't mean much. Action was what mattered. Richard's negotiation skills had forced the airline to the table, and he was now pushing for more than just a review. "James," Richard said one evening as they sat in their living room, "we're going to make sure that this incident serves as a catalyst for real change. We're talking about diversity training for every employee, accountability mechanisms, and perhaps even a public forum where the airline can show its commitment to equality. This isn't just a problem to fix. This is an opportunity." James nodded, feeling a sense of empowerment. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what his father had meant when he spoke about using one's voice for good. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about changing things for the better, leaving a lasting impact. But the more the situation developed, the more James realized that the story wasn't only about the airline and Linda Harper, it was about the power dynamics that had allowed her behavior to go unchecked. It was about the subtle yet pervasive biases that lingered in every industry, in every corner of society. And it was about how individuals, no matter their age or status, could use their voice to call attention to those biases and demand accountability. As the news cycle continued, Linda Harper found herself increasingly isolated. Her colleagues distanced themselves from her, some even going so far as to make statements about how her behavior had tarnished the reputation of the airline. The pressure mounted, and she found herself called into a series of meetings with the airline's HR department. It wasn't long before she was placed on unpaid leave, pending further investigation. Linda had never imagined this would be her fate. She had thought her years of service would protect her, that her position would shield her from the consequences of her actions. But she had been wrong. And as the days passed, she realized that the incident was not just a blemish on her career, it was a reflection of the systemic issues she had ignored for so long. Her colleagues, too, were affected by the fallout. Some expressed their support for her, but most stayed silent, unwilling to publicly defend her actions. Those who had witnessed the confrontation between Linda and James were uncomfortable with the way the situation had been handled, and they, too, began to question their own roles within the airline. Meanwhile, James's life began to change in ways he had never expected. What had started as a frustrating, humiliating experience had turned into something bigger than he could have ever imagined. His name was becoming synonymous with fairness and equality, and he had become the face of a movement that was slowly gaining momentum across the country. But James wasn't content to rest on his newfound fame. He knew that this was just the beginning. He and his father began to speak with journalists, community leaders, and activists, brainstorming ways to create lasting change. Their goal wasn't to make headlines for the sake of it, it was to create policies and practices that would prevent others from experiencing the kind of injustice James had faced. They talked about the need for corporations to address bias in hiring, training, and customer service. They pushed for schools and businesses to invest in diversity initiatives that went beyond surface-level changes. James, who had once been content to sit quietly in the back of the plane, now found himself leading conversations about systemic change, his voice confident and steady. He wasn't just a teenager anymore. He was a symbol of hope and resilience, proving that even the smallest ripple could spark a wave of transformation. And so, as the investigation into Linda Harper continued and the airline's efforts to mitigate the damage unfolded, the real work began. James and his father had set something in motion, something that would reshape the airline industry, and perhaps even extend beyond it. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: James Walker had taken a painful moment of injustice and turned it into a catalyst for lasting change. He had shown that even the most unexpected heroes could rise to the occasion and change the world, one ripple at a time. The winds of change. The ripple caused by James Walker's experience in the air had begun to transform into a powerful current, sweeping across industries and communities. The fallout from Linda Harper's unjust actions had become the spark for an entirely new movement, one that transcended the incident itself. While many were still reeling from the impact of the story's virality, James had quickly become something of a figurehead for change, representing not just one boy's struggle but the collective experiences of so many who had been marginalized and dismissed. James was at home one morning, sitting at the kitchen table with his father, when his phone buzzed. It was another email from a major media outlet, this time requesting an interview with James himself, this time for a primetime news special. The inbox was flooded with messages from journalists, civil rights leaders, and even celebrities offering their support. While the attention was overwhelming, Richard reminded his son that they had a mission: to ensure the airline's response wasn't just about public relations, but real reform. But it wasn't just the airline that was feeling the heat. The incident had raised uncomfortable questions for corporations in all sectors. Other industries began to assess their own diversity training, employee behavior protocols, and their responses to customer complaints. Suddenly, businesses everywhere were being forced to reckon with the reality that discrimination, often subtle but deeply ingrained, was still present in the workforce. James's experience had ignited a flame that wasn't going out anytime soon. Meanwhile, the airline's executives had grown increasingly uneasy. They had tried to manage the situation quietly, but the media pressure, public outrage, and mounting backlash had created an unmanageable storm. The airline's board of directors called for an emergency meeting to discuss a potential course of action. They couldn't afford to lose customers, particularly in the wake of the viral attention that the incident had attracted. Inside the corporate boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. Executives traded glances, uncertain of how to proceed. The case had quickly escalated, and it was no longer about a single flight attendant or a teenage boy in first class. This was now a public relations disaster, one that had brought their company under a microscope. The name, James Walker, was quickly becoming a household term, and the airline was left scrambling for a way to make things right. As the pressure mounted, the CEO of the airline made a decision that few anticipated. He requested a direct meeting with Richard and James. The executives, aware that a simple apology wouldn't suffice, had come to the conclusion that the best way forward was to work with James and his family, not just to apologize, but to implement long-term changes that would address the issues that had been exposed. It wasn't long before the Walkers received an invitation to the airline's headquarters for an official meeting with the airline's CEO and their senior leadership team. James, though apprehensive about what would come of the meeting, understood the importance of using this moment to push for real, tangible change. He was no longer just the victim in the story, he was an advocate, a voice for the voiceless. At the meeting, Richard and James were met with a well-prepared team of executives, each of them eager to find a resolution. The CEO, a middle-aged man with a calm but confident demeanor, led the conversation. "Mr. Walker, James," he began, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of the situation, "I want to start by apologizing, again, for what happened. We are truly sorry for the way you were treated. We've taken steps to address the actions of Linda Harper, but we recognize that this goes beyond one individual." Richard nodded, but his eyes remained focused. "I appreciate the apology, but words are just that, words. This can't be swept under the rug, and it can't be just a matter of HR firing someone. You need to understand that this isn't just about one flight attendant, it's about the culture within this company, and how your policies, or lack of policies, contribute to that culture. The CEO's expression tightened slightly, but he nodded in agreement. We are aware that we have a lot of work to do. We don't want to be just another company that issues a press release and moves on. We are committed to real change. James listened carefully. He was beginning to realize that what his father had said was true. This wasn't just about one bad flight. This was about pushing for a comprehensive overhaul of how airlines, and other companies, treat their customers. And if this company could be the first domino to fall, then the impact could be felt across the world. We've already begun an internal review of our practices, the CEO continued. We'll be launching a company-wide diversity and inclusion training program, and we're also looking into how we handle customer complaints. However, we want your input. You've become a symbol of something much bigger than just this airline, and we'd like to know what steps you think we should take to make things right. Richard and James exchanged a look. They had been prepared for this moment, but now that they were here, the weight of the responsibility was clear. James had always dreamed of making a difference, but he had never imagined it would be on this scale. I think it's about more than just training, James said, his voice clear and steady. You need to create a system of accountability where employees are held responsible for their actions, not just in their training, but in their daily interactions with passengers. You also need to look at how people of color are treated across the board, not just in first class, but in all cabins. Your staff needs to understand that they can't make assumptions based on appearance, and they certainly can't treat someone differently because they don't fit a certain mold. Richard nodded in agreement. And beyond that, this is about creating a culture of inclusivity. There should be no question in anyone's mind that customers, no matter their race, background, or age, are all entitled to the same level of respect. There should be zero tolerance for discrimination. You can't just teach your employees to be nice, you need to make sure that your policies and practices reflect this kind of respect. The room was quiet for a moment. The weight of what James and Richard were suggesting wasn't lost on the executives. The changes they were proposing were significant, and the implications for the airline's operations were profound. But the CEO, though visibly challenged by the scope of the request, nodded slowly. Understood. We are prepared to make these changes, Mr. Walker, he said. But we're going to need time to implement them. And we're committed to making sure it's done right. James felt a sense of pride swell within him. They had done it. They had taken a single, terrible moment and turned it into an opportunity for systemic change. It was not just about punishing the airline or punishing Linda Harper, it was about changing how things worked, on a much larger scale. As the meeting drew to a close, James and his father exchanged a quiet but meaningful glance. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was only the beginning. The changes they had set in motion would take time, and there would likely be setbacks. But James knew one thing for certain, he had just taken the first step toward changing the world. And in that moment, he realized that what had begun as a painful experience for him had become something much greater. The winds of change were blowing, and James Walker had found himself at the forefront of it all. As they left the airline's headquarters, James felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that his struggle had turned into something powerful and lasting. This wasn't just about one boy's story, it was about creating a legacy of equality and respect that would reverberate across generations to come. And it all started with the courage to stand up and say, "This isn't right."